We begin this news hour in Ukraine, where a helicopter crash has killed 14 people. It happened on the outskirts of the capital in the town of Brovary. Amongst the dead are the country's Interior Minister, Denis Monastrisky, and two other top officials. One child was also killed as the helicopter crashed right next to a kindergarten. 25 people are in hospital, including 11 children. Officials say the Interior Minister and his officials were on their way to inspect front lines in the east. Ukraine's State Security Service said it was following several possible causes of the crash, which include sabotage as well as a technical malfunction or breach of flight rules.
We confirm the death of Interior Minister Denis Monastrisky and Deputy Interior Minister Yevhen Yenin and the State Secretary of the Ministry of Internal Affairs.
President Volodymyr Zelensky described the crash as a black day for Ukraine. And speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Ukraine's Deputy Economic Minister paid this tribute to Interior Minister Denis Monastrisky.
I mean, this is unbearable. Like, every time you think you're getting adopted to the new level of tragedy, and then another thing hits you. So this is a tragic moment, definitely. And I'm kind of barely holding my tears because...
In a separate development, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has hit out at the US and the EU for their involvement in Ukraine, saying what's happening is the result of a hybrid war. He said the crisis began long before the so-called military operation in Ukraine in February of last year. He even compared the West's policies towards Russia with Adolf Hitler's treatment of the Jews. The foreign minister was speaking at a news conference in Moscow as part of an annual review of Russia's foreign policy.
What is happening now in Ukraine is the result of many years of preparations by the United States and their satellite states to the start of the global hybrid war against the Russian Federation. To be honest, nobody is trying to conceal that. Just as Napoleon mobilized almost the whole of Europe against the Russian Empire, as Hitler mobilized, captured, and enlisted the majority of the European countries and deployed them against the Soviet Union. So it is the same now. The United States have created a coalition which includes almost all Europe that are NATO members and EU members, as well. Using Ukraine, they are waging a war against our country with the same task, the final solution to the Russian question. Just as Hitler wanted a final solution to the Jewish question.
Sergei Lavrov. Well, for more on that helicopter crash and the war in Ukraine, let's speak to Arise chief correspondent John Cookson, who's monitoring developments from London. Good to see you, John. Do we know the cause of the crash yet? I understand it was quite a misty day at the time of the crash.
Hey, Charles, good to see you. No, well, the investigation is underway, headed by the SBU, the Secret Service in Ukraine. They're looking at three possible reasons for this helicopter to fall out of the skies. You mentioned a couple of them earlier. First of all, technical malfunction. Sabotage hasn't been ruled out, but is unlikely. Or that it was shot down by some kind of Russian drone. And the investigation is looking at all those. And tonight it's looking very much like a tragic accident, although all the evidence hasn't been collected yet. This chopper that they were flying in, Charles, has got a bit of a checkered record. It was an EC-225 Super Puma helicopter made by a branch of Airbus. There have been 1,000 made already, and they operate in 60 countries. The Ukrainians have 51 of them, Charles. They cost $81 million each, and these are the kinds of helicopters that are used in the North Sea to ferry workers out to oil and gas rigs. They're big, they have a long range. Now, I say a checkered history because there's a very, very similar, if this indeed was an accident, a similar accident in 2016 when a rotor blade on one of these 225 Super Pumas simply snapped away due to metal fatigue. And again, in 2009, Charles, there was another very similar accident. The accident in 2016 killed 14 people. So I'm thinking that the investigation is going to be looking possibly at metal fatigue. And the initial inquiries tonight seem to suggest that there's no evidence of foul play already. The Ukrainians, of course, reeling from the attack at the weekend on a housing block in Dnipro, which killed 45 people. And now we have this tragedy today.
Well, absolutely, John. How much is this also a symbolic damage to Ukraine, given that the dead include the country's interior minister and several senior officials in the ministry? I mean, that must be a significant blow to Ukraine.
It is a significant blow, and why 6 senior officials in total were traveling in the same chopper on the same day at the same time is something that is an open question. Tonight, the conditions were foggy. Maybe it was the only way of getting that number of people down to what was called a hotspot by government officials today. It was obviously a long journey that were going on, and perhaps they didn't have another helicopter spare. But I think the Ukrainians have probably learned a lesson from this, not to have senior officials on board, including, of course, Denis Monastrsky, who you mentioned earlier. Monastrsky, elected to Parliament in 2019, he's a former lawyer, became Interior Minister in 2021, very close to the President, of course. He was in charge of the National Guard, the elite Azov Regiment, and also the National Police. So to lose someone like that, it is a huge blow to the government. And of course, his deputy, Yemen, his first deputy, in fact. And there were other officials on board. And so, as I say, there are questions tonight. Why, oh why, with so many important people traveling in the same helicopter, in a war zone, early in the morning, in fog? Big questions, Charles.
Well, quite, John. Meanwhile, in a separate development, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying he's yet to see any serious proposals for peace in Ukraine, and that any talks must address Moscow's wider security concerns. He called President Zelensky's peace plans completely absurd, but he also said Russia was ready to respond to any concrete initiatives. What's your reading of that?
How many times have we heard this from Lavrov? It's something he trots out, every month or so to give the Russians presumably the high ground. And of course, this kind of conversation from Lavrov is really aimed at the domestic audience, to the Russian people who watch state-controlled television all the time. So let's bear that in mind. I mean, there have been discussions between both sides, but Russia isn't prepared to give up the 4 regions that it annexed late last year and Crimea. Zelensky saying, I won't talk peace until the Russians are out of my country altogether and they give up any claims to territory that they've seized. And just remind ourselves that the Russians tonight are still in control of around 70,000 kilometers of Ukrainian land, if you include Crimea. So, yeah, I mean, it's all very interesting, Charles, but Lavrov said this so many times before. Hopefully one day, there will be meaningful peace talks, because all wars end with peace talks, and that will in due course happen here. We're a long way off at the moment, and the first thing to happen, of course, is a ceasefire, but we're nowhere near that.
John, thanks very much indeed. John Cookson, Arise chief correspondent, talking to me from London.